And welcome to Libertarian Counterpoint. I am your host, James Just, and with me today is Mr. Jason McPhee from the Knuckleheads of Liberty. Jason, it actually is good you're on the thing today, talking about knuckleheads, because we've got RFK is trying to start a new party to run for president. And what I find interesting about this, and where the Libertarians come into this, is he's actually scheduled to speak at the California Libertarian Convention to come in March, which, as a Libertarian Party member, this makes no real sense. I can understand why some Libertarians may be interested in hearing from RFK, but at a political party convention, you don't want to hear from somebody who's starting a different political party. You want to hear from someone who's trying to take your party somewhere higher, somewhere better, somewhere, you know, move the needle, so to speak. And I just don't understand. You're probably the wrong person to actually ask about inside the party politics. But from an outsider's perspective, what does this kind of look like from someone who's sitting outside the Libertarian Party but inside the Libertarian philosophy?
Yeah, well, you know, and actually I am a registered Libertarian, so I'm sort of in the party. I just don't really participate in a lot of the party business.
Yeah, well, I'll take care of that come April, but that's a different discussion.
Okay. Well, boy, what did I step into? But yeah, I tell you, it's kind of interesting. You know, if it's anything like a normal convention, it'd actually be interesting to hear what a guy like RFK thinks while he's trying to navigate these crazy waters that the duopoly sets up to keep people off the ballot, and that's one of the things he's struggling with. I guess it's the what is it? The peace and or not the peace and freedom, but the We the People Party. I think.
Yeah, is what he's trying to start, something like that. Yeah,
exactly. And so that's trying to start up here in California. He needs like 75,000 signatures, I think, to get on the ballot with that. But that said, it's you know, he should be able to run as a Democrat, and they won't let him run as a Democrat. So you know, maybe him coming over and talking in front of the Libertarians will shine a little bit of a light on Libertarians, which may help in the end.
Well, except they're ignoring him, so they're not even going to get any outside coverage because of it, right? The media is just going to ignore the fact that he's there because they don't care who comes and talks to the Libertarian Convention, and so it's not going to do anything. I mean, I don't want to be overly harsh about it. It just doesn't make any logical sense. Why you're going to, during a presidential year, instead of having, you know, inviting some of our presidential candidates to come and give this speak, or to, you know, go back and reach back to some of, you know, ask Ron Paul or Rand Paul or someone who has a long history of advocating for libertarian ideals. We're asking a lifelong Democrat who's shares about 50% of libertarian ideals, right? He's not even in the 70–80% where we go, okay, we can look the other way. Yeah. He's kind of halfway. It just doesn't make any sense to me, and for me, it kind of it's a example of the directionlessness that the current party has. You know, we've gone from, you know, the old guard, and now we have the whole takeover thing that happened, and yet we're still directionless, and it's sad to me. But
I think the tea leaves were a little bit set when you saw at Pork Fest, and I didn't go to Pork Fest. I want to go to Pork Fest one of these days, but that's a libertarian convention that happens out of New Hampshire every year. But RFK was a speaker there too as well, and so I heard he had a lot of people who were interested in what he had to say there. So
yeah, well, Pork Fest makes sense, right? Pork Fest, Freedom Fest, those kind of things make sense where you have a wide variety of speakers come in, rather than a political party where you actually want to hear from party insiders about where they're going, what they're doing, and it makes me wonder about, you know, is the LP on its own death spiral? Because this brings them up. California there's an article here that's talking about California's economic death spiral. You know, the latest evidence we're talking about, either it's the consequences of AB 5, or recently it's the fast food wage increase, which we talked about last week a little bit. So we're going to kind of recover a little.
$20 an hour. Right?
$20 an hour minimum for fast food workers. They've raised the wage for healthcare workers between $18 to $23 an hour, maybe, right? If you're getting your check from the government, they may delay that wage increase because the government can't afford it right now. But somehow the fast food worker company can afford the mandatory pay raise. But, you know, somehow the fast food budget is different than the government budget.
A politician can never be too generous when he's reaching into somebody else's pocket.
Yeah, they don't have to write the check, but if the government has to write the check, you know, we may delay this wage increase because it's cost too much. Yeah, you're right. The wage increase may cost too much. It's going to, just as much as it costs too much for the government budget, it costs too much for the, the budget of those. People think of McDonald's and Burger Kings and these places as big, huge corporations, but most of them are franchisees. And a franchisee may own 10, 12, 20 stores, but it's not the same thing as Burger King, or it's not the same thing as McDonald's. You don't have the scale to kind of absorb the costs. And we're going to see it. You're going to see it. We've seen in Arizona, they now have a complete automated McDonald's.
Yeah.
Yeah. So somebody comes in, loads up the machines every morning, and the McDonald's runs by itself. And that's where we're going to head.
Yeah. And this is the terrible thing. I mean, this is just a truism of economics. It's, economics is sort of an abstract type of science, and, you really have to a lot of times study it to understand what's really happening out there in the economy. But, when you raise a minimum wage, what you're really doing is you're setting an obstacle for somebody to work. You're saying somebody's labor has to be worth that much. And so, I imagine the politician is probably thinking, well, somebody's got to do the job, so if we push the wage up, they'll pay it. But the problem is they're actually competing, like you just said, with robots in some of these places, I believe. There's automation and other things like that.
Or just not getting it done. If it costs too much to do something, then you're just not going to, the other option is to not do it.
Yeah.
If it costs, value is value. Or the other thing that can happen is if you got someone, say, who used to make $13 an hour, $15 an hour, and someone else was making $25 an hour supervising them, well, the guy who was making $13 an hour gets a raise to 20. Well, the guy who's getting 25 gets a raise to 25 because there's no more money left over to give him a raise. So your high performers, your good workers, your high performers are going to have, they're actually going to get paid less than your workers who need assistance, shall we say, to get the job done. It seems to me like they're just protecting bad workers.
Well, and it's funny, too, because that's exactly the way government works as well. When they hire people, there's usually a union scale, and pretty much everybody gets paid the same. So you have somebody who's a hard worker or somebody who's not a hard worker. The only thing that really matters is the time you've been with the company or the government. Okay.
And if you're someone who works fast or who works at high quality, just as your nature, and you're going to be less rewarded than someone who comes in and, what is it called, quiet quitting. They're simply going to do the bare minimum of their job. And so, okay, which is fine, but you're going to get paid the bare minimum for your job for doing that. Yeah. Versus someone who comes in, goes a little bit above and beyond, doesn't need much supervision. You can trust them to do their task. So they should get paid more, but under the conditions California's setting up, that's not going to happen.
But the sad thing is, what really happens if you're a smart entrepreneur, what you're going to do is you're going to try to empower a few employees with the tools to make them more efficient, and the rest you're going to let go so that you can still manage to cover those costs and stay competitive with places that aren't under the same jurisdictional requirements.
And oddly enough, as the growth of AI, it's not AI that's going to take people's jobs. It's people who use AI is going to take the jobs of people who don't. Mm-hmm. People who are effective at using it are going to thrive, and people who aren't are going to be left behind because the value they produce isn't what the value the government creates.
But then government to the rescue again with UBI.
We'll create UBI. Story. we'll take some more money from the people who are productive to give it to the people who want to be productive but can't because we've priced them out of the market. And this kind of interference in our daily lives, it creates a cultural death spiral, right? Whether it's homelessness, we've got homelessness crisis, we've got people fleeing the state, the people who can are fleeing the state. Whatever, the 25% of the income taxes, I think, have left. We've lost 25% of income taxes simply because people have left.
Yeah, but that's not quite from just people who've left. That's a big part of it, but some of it is just because these things ebb and flow with people's investment returns as well. So the people who are at the upper end too, when they have a bad year, when you put all those taxes on them, they're not going to pay as much that year that they have less profits. So, there you go.
Yeah, and then you've got, the crime that increases. And, for those of us, we sat here 4 years ago now, and we talked about, the consequences of the COVID mandates and the lockdowns were going to extend far beyond the economy, far beyond health. It was going to actually go into our culture. And you add that to things like AB 5, which took effect just before it. which, AB5 destroyed the gig economy in California, which destroyed the creative economy. If you're a creator, if you are someone who works at, say, a local theater company, right? A lot of those have their things way scaled back because they can't afford to pay people as employees. They can afford to pay someone to come in for a night. Here's your $80. They can afford to do that. But now you've got to hire them as an employee. You got to pay all extra kind of insurance. They can't afford it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of those cultural fabric that holds our communities together was gone. It was literally and deliberately taken away. And now they said, oh, we'll give you some money back and we will help rebuild your communities. Except now that there's a big, huge budget deficit, what money is going to go away? That's the money that's going to go away. It's the discretionary spending, the spending for the arts, to compensate for allegedly to compensate for the destruction that AB5 created.
Yeah, and it's horrible because they set this up with the idea that it was mainly going to hit Uber and Lyft drivers, but it's catching all of these people like, hey, if you're a musician or something else and you want to come in and do a few gigs, or if you're a writer, that's another thing. If you're write for newspapers, if you do, I think, more than a certain amount of, columns for them a year, then they have to put you as a regular employee.
And those who had unions to represent them managed to get exemptions for all these things, So it's amazing what happened when there's someone to give them money to get your exemption written into the bill. Yeah. And the exemptions made no sense. Some places got an exemption, others didn't, and they sold it for Uber and Lyft. That's what they did, but it was never just for Uber and Lyft. It was always intended to gut the freelancer economy, which we talked about last week. They're going they're following that prescription on the national level, and it's disastrous. It was disastrous for California. It's going to be disastrous for the rest of the country.
Well, it's one thing after another of these central planners coming in and telling you that you don't know what's good for you, but we do. And thank goodness we're here, because now we are going to set up constraints on who you can work for and how and everything else. But don't worry, we're doing it in your benefit. We're here for you. But in reality, they're just setting up more barriers, to make it harder for people to employ them.
Yeah.
So.
And Richard actually has something to say about these bureaucrats sitting there getting in the way, and how the current court system allows for the bureaucracy to have an unfair advantage on deciding public policy. So let's hear what Richard has to say about Chevron defense, or deference.
This is Richard Fields with a report from the fields. The U.S. Supreme Court recently heard arguments on relentless versus the Department of Commerce. At issue is whether the Department of Commerce, under its mandate to prevent overfishing, has the authority to mandate that fishing boats must be required to pay the salary of a government game warden riding along on their fishing expeditions to police whether any overfishing is occurring. The fishermen think that policy is not only a bad one, but unconstitutional and potentially financially ruinous. The government cites Chevron deference in saying that the courts should defer to the best judgment of regulatory agencies. The problem is that this policy makes the following scenario probable. First, Congress votes to do what they think is a very good thing, in this case, prevent overfishing. But rather than get involved in the messy details of how to actually do that, they simply create an agency to achieve the end they're looking for in whatever way the agency wants to do it. Then the president appoints the agency personnel. Depending on the political leanings of the president, it's quite possible that the agency gets staffed with zealous political ideologues. These partisans then get the privilege of effectively writing laws by drafting the environmental enforcement rules and regulations. If the regulated industries don't like the new regulations, they have to appeal to an administrative law judge of the agency that drafted the regulations, not an independent court. Then, when the agency predictably says that regulations are just fine, outside courts refuse to hear an appeal because of Chevron deference. In Relentless, the Supreme Court is considering whether to modify or overturn this catch-22 in the legal system. In oral arguments, the three liberal justices are predictably arguing to retain Chevron deference. The three conservative justices are making noises about overturning Chevron, and the three moderate justices are trying to cobble together some middle ground. The danger is that we'll end up with a mess like the Roberts decision on Obamacare or the Kennedy opinion on what constitutes wetlands. Still, any decision that lessens the current system, where regulatory agencies are effectively the writers of laws, the enforcers of the laws they write, and the judge on whether their laws are constitutional, will be a long-sought step forward. This is Richard Fields with reports from the fields. See you again next week.
All right. Thank you, Richard. And, you know, Jason, this was it's an interesting question, because what experts in the field do you actually listen to, right? We've gone through this last few years where, you know, listen to the experts, but which experts do you listen to is the question, right? And this is what goes down to it do the courts give complete deference to the experts of the government, or are they supposed to kind of listen to everybody's evidence and make a decision?
Yeah, and I mean, personally, I think that, you know, if you're going to slap a civil penalty on somebody, they should be able to avail themselves of the court. I mean, that's what the Seventh Amendment is all about. So, and I think it was for $20, I think, is what it said in the actual Seventh Amendment, that if you're going to be penalized by the government, by a government agency, then for above that much that you have the right to a civil trial. But even now, I think they said if you had account for inflation, that's like $350. So, I mean, clearly, all these cases we're talking about, they're for that amount or more easily. I mean, we're talking about in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know, for a lot of these cases. Yeah, so you should be able to take it to court. Because
we've seen this, that the bureaucracy shouldn't be able to ruin a business or a person just because they decided to change a rule arbitrarily, and now, you know, some person or company has to abide by these rules that may make no sense, or even worse, may have been encouraged to be put there by their competitors, right? We know this happens, and so this is a reason it's named Chevron. You know, this case was decided because Chevron was you know, it was an oil company, and the government were arguing over, I forget the exact details of that case, but the government was, you know, wanted to tell Chevron, the oil company, what to do. And of course, in that case, it probably made sense because it's this big oil company. I think there were some environmental regulations or something and it's okay, maybe it made sense in that case, but now we've got the bureaucrats, you know, sticking the little noses in every nook and cranny of your life, and not based upon laws, based upon, we just feel we're going to make those regulations. It's really kind of strange. And we're talking about how this destroys trust, right? This destroys trust in the bureaucracy, but we've also seen how this can destroy trust in our medical establishments. We've seen the last few years how the medical establishments trust the science, even though we haven't done it yet. Well, now measles is surging in Britain, in UK, because, well, they're alleging that people are now skeptical of, you know, the medical science. And why wouldn't they be skeptical of medical science?
And this is a problem. I mean, you know, when government abuses its authority, you know, it tries to set itself up as a scientific authority in a lot of these cases, and when there's other motives, or when it turns out that they don't have the actual data that they seem to claim that these things are about, then what they don't realize at the time is they're destroying trust. I remember in the story where they were trying to find Osama bin Laden, one of the things that the CIA did was that they actually sent people around in the guise of giving vaccines in Pakistan, I believe it was, to try and root out where he was. And so the idea is that you're literally now making people skeptical of all of these vaccines in the future, because, you know, are they really trying to give me a vaccine, or do they have some other motive here that they're doing? And of course, with lockdowns, we saw that had tremendous problems. And of course, the guy who was in charge, Fauci, was lying about everything. I mean, he was lying about whether or not he was funding gain-of-function research. He tried to shut down anybody who was actually looking into, you know, whether or not this came from a lab or anything else. And it's just, you know, it's terrible. I mean, you know, he tried to really, take a hatchet to people like Jay Bhattacharya and others, literally saying we've got to silence these people in internal emails that we're going back and forth with. Other people who were running things, I can't remember all their names at the moment.
Yeah, but trust the science became, well, how can you trust the science? But also this notion that when we make things mandatory, you make people actually question it, because you have to question it. The minute something becomes mandatory, you have to go, okay, why are you having to make this mandatory? You're actually encouraging people to look into it. And the question I like to ask nowadays is, okay, so what are the downsides? A lot of times when people have some policy, right, they'll sit down and they'll tell you all the potential upsides. Okay, so in order so I know you've thought it through, tell me what the potential downsides are. And if you can't tell me a potential downside, then I know you haven't thought it through. Because if you've thought it through, you've at least said, okay, well, on the worst case scenario, this, and this can happen. And then that will, create distrust within the community and how to, but I don't think that's going to happen. And but you should be able to go through and understand what the worst case scenarios are, what the potential downfalls of any public policy are. But today you find so many people who just regurgitate the talking points and you clearly haven't thought it through, because he can't tell you a single thing that might go wrong.
Yeah. And that was the sad thing, is that people just claimed this mantle of the science. And it turned out a lot of them were just making stuff up. I mean, to talk about the 6-foot rule of social distancing, and there was no actual science that came out of that. I mean, when they talked about masks, I mean, the idea that anybody who's ever worked in a laboratory situation knows that you have protocols that you use when you use a mask. You don't just simply put a mask on and wear it around. In fact, you usually have to wear eye protection too, because it's you're trying to cover your mucous membranes, and the idea that that's funny, they're not making people wear eye protection. People are just taking these masks on, putting them off, touching their faces and everything else. There was not really any science behind any of this. This was just, it's kind of like a safety theater almost, Yeah,
well, it was safety theater, and it's one of those things. There was a lot of theoretical science. Well, theoretically, if you wear the mask, these kind of things happen, but in the real world, in the practical, it doesn't work, because the masks don't fit. People mess with their face, and they take it on, take it off. They wear it all day rather than changing it every 2 hours like you're supposed to. There's all these details that actually matter when it comes to practical use of these things, rather than the theoretical what could happen in a perfect scenario.
Well, the crazy thing is, real science, if everybody knows what real science is about, it's very market oriented, in the sense that you have to convince other people, and you do that by publishing, and people whether or not they believe you, maybe they use your credibility, maybe somebody else tries to test it, see if they get the same results, and maybe if a whole bunch of people start to do that, then everybody just starts going along, because that seems to be the right way. But you're always probing and testing. It's not about edicts. It's not about somebody from the top says something and says, there's a famous quote from a guy named Richard Feynman. He was a physicist, and we talked about this on the Knucklehead of Noise Patrol for our Liberty quote of the day. But he wasn't really a libertarian. He had a wonderful quote, and he said, "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned." And I mean, that's exactly what the people who claim to be representing the science are today. They want to give you answers that can't be questioned.
Yeah, but of course, science only happens because you question answers that have already been given. That is literally what science is. But we're talking about central planners, so we're going to move on here real quick. We've got like 3 minutes left. Spirit Airlines is looking like it's going to have to file for bankruptcy. Now, they tried to merge Spirit with, I'm drawing a blank on the other one. What was it? Spirit and the other low-cost airlines. I forget what it is. Well, Spirit was going to merge with
JetBlue.
JetBlue, thank you. And they were going to merge because Spirit can no longer survive. But the government says, no, it's going to be uncompetitive if Spirit and JetBlue merge. There's going to be one less carrier on the market, so you're going to have less options to the consumer. But of course, by not merging, you've now put Spirit out of business, so you're going to have less options to begin with. It's one of these things where the government doesn't really understand what the consequences of their decisions really are. I don't think bureaucrats really understand economics very well.
You think?
I'm just thinking. Or they're not interested in actual economics, maybe the other actual quest.
Well, I think that the bottom line is there are people who are full of themselves. They think that they're smart people and they can make decisions for everybody else. And, you know, so they're sitting
and
on
so you
their
end up
little-
with
Yeah.
But these are, you would think that they would look at these things like I was just talking about and say, okay, what are the potential downsides if we say no to this merger? And they pretend like the potential downside is, oh, there will be no potential downsides. It'll just go back to the way things are now and it'll be fine. But the reason they needed to merge was because Spirit is not economically viable anymore for whatever reason, right? We know these low-cost airlines, once they get about 10 years old, the costs of maintenance costs, you know, the legacy costs start to add up. And so that's why these low-cost airlines don't last very long. And so you grow and you merge and you get bigger, so that's how they can survive, and they end up becoming someone like Southwest eventually. You know, hopefully. That's kind of the plan. But you can't grow to be big in Southwest if the government doesn't let you sit there and buy up failing companies.
Well, you know, the dirty secret of all this is that monopolies really happen because government gets involved. I mean, that's truly what's happening here. I mean, in almost every situation, if somebody starts to get big, you know, you can always, let's imagine somebody bought up all the movie theaters. Well, you know, in the end, what keeps them from then being able to charge you $100 for a movie theater ticket is because you can just go do something else. You don't have to go to the movies, right? I mean, the bottom line is that, you know, in the end, it's what are your alternatives, you know, that keep people in line on the prices they can charge, and whether or not that's direct competitors or just substitutes. Those are what keep prices in line. It's not, you don't need the government's big hand coming in and moving the pieces around, because in the end, government is actually giving people special rights, and that's what really creates monopolies in the marketplace.
Yeah, when the government goes around putting their fingers on the scales, and even if they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart, they're really genuinely thinking they're doing the right thing, but the reality is they don't think these things all the way through because they don't understand how economics impacts each other. There's a lack of understanding. And, you know, it's like in the 60s and 70s, we were all talking about how the price of labor stagnated, right, in the 70s and 80s. Well, it's because in the 60s and 70s, we increased the labor market by how much? You know, 40%. When women came into the market, into the labor market en masse, good, but, you know, supply and demand, when you've increased the supply of labor, without a significant, you know, the similar increase in demand for labor, the price of labor is going to drop. Yeah. And so that's why the labor stagnated for so long. It's because you quite simply supply and demand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so
that's a good story with everything. It's all about supply and demand. If we just get people to understand that, we'd be almost halfway to solving all our problems.
Okay. All right. We've got about 30 seconds left, Jason. We've got one story left. A California lawmaker is going around the country trying to flip state houses, right? As if California is a functional state. Why are these people spending time running around the country trying to get more of them to work like California?
Yeah, I think they want to flip it from the bottom up to turn everything blue, but boy, I tell you, why anybody would want to turn blue after seeing what's happened in most of our bluetopian cities, I don't know.
I don't know either. You know, it looks like we are out of time according to my calendar. So Jason, my clock, we are out of time. Thank you for being here, Jason. Thank you for watching us. Thank everybody for working hard inside the studio room. And we're out of here. See you next week. Please remember to love everybody, and good night.
Stay free.